We begin our story in 1991. The mighty edifice of the Soviet Union has collapsed. Across Eastern Europe and parts of Central Asia, dozens of new states are born. People take to the streets. Celebrations erupt. It is a moment not just of political change, but of hope for the future. And in Ukraine, a historic referendum takes place. More than 92% of voters say yes to sovereignty. For the first time in more than 3 centuries, Ukraine will stand as an independent nation. A new Ukrainian state is born. But independence brings with it difficult questions. What happens to the massive Soviet arsenal left behind, including nuclear weapons? How does a nation ensure its security in a volatile region? And what is the role of the increasingly unpredictable Russia? These questions will dominate the years to come. But in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is little time to ponder. There is a new state to build. New institutions must be created. A new constitution drafted, and in this moment of challenge and opportunity, a team of young reformers, many of them educated in the West, get down to work. Among them, a charismatic leader, Viktor Yushchenko, who would later become president, ponders the nuclear question. How should Ukraine, a nation of 52 million people, some territories heavily contaminated by the Chernobyl disaster, inherit the world's 3rd largest stockpile of nuclear weapons? The international community is worried about the potential instability. US officials fear the weapons could end up in the hands of organized crime groups, or worse, radical nationalists. Many of these weapons are deployed in Ukraine. As a compromise, in late 1991, Ukraine agrees to keep the weapons but not to use them. Then, in 1992, Ukraine ratifies the Non-Proliferation Treaty, committing itself to not expand its nuclear program. But these steps are seen as insufficient by the West, which remains concerned that Ukraine might sell the weapons to the highest bidder. By 1993, US intelligence agencies estimate that Ukraine has around 1,900 nuclear warheads. This includes some 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the United States. Washington wants those weapons gone, and fast. But Ukraine is wary. Giving up the weapons would leave it vulnerable to potential Russian aggression. Who would protect it against a possible attack? As talks continue, the Clinton administration increases pressure. Then, in 1994, an agreement is reached. Ukraine, along with neighboring Belarus and Kazakhstan, signs the Budapest Memorandum with Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The deal is simple on paper, but monumental in significance. Ukraine agrees to give up its nuclear weapons. In exchange, the great powers guarantee Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and borders. But this agreement is not legally binding. It is built on something much less tangible: trust. And it is a bold move by Ukraine. The country is placing its trust in international promises, hoping this agreement will protect its future. The weapons are shipped out and destroyed. By 1996, Ukraine is free of nuclear weapons. But at the same time, Russia faces its own transition. The Soviet Empire is gone, but Moscow still seeks to preserve influence over its neighbors. To that end, the relationship with Ukraine is particularly important. For Russia, Ukraine serves as a buffer zone between itself and the West. In the early 1990s, Moscow was eager to maintain close ties with Kyiv, partly out of fear of NATO expansion and partly out of respect for the wishes of the Ukrainian people. It is a complicated calculation, one that will evolve over time. For Ukraine, these early years are filled with both hope and uncertainty. The country is balancing newfound freedom with the shadow of its powerful former ruler. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia in the post-Soviet era is fraught with tension. On the one hand, shared history, culture, and language create a sense of closeness. On the other, the stark realities of power and the lust for control create a legacy of distrust. As we move into the 21st century, that distrust will only grow. By the late 1990s, Ukraine is still navigating its identity. Independent, but not free from the historical, cultural, and even geographical ties to Russia. Their relationship is complicated, to say the least. And in 1997, another delicate issue comes to the table: the fate of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. A powerful naval force that was once the pride of Moscow. Now it's split between Russia and Ukraine. A squadron of ships and submarines sits in the port of Sevastopol in Crimea, along with a bunch of weapons and military bases. It's a big deal. Russia wants it all back. Ukraine wants to keep it all. So, how do they split the difference? Tough negotiations go down, and finally, a compromise is reached. Russia takes control of 81.7% of the fleet's ships and weapons, including all of the nuclear assets. But, in return, Ukraine grants Russia the right to use the strategic port of Sevastopol in Crimea until 2017, plus, Moscow agrees to pay Kyiv $2.5 billion over 20 years. Just 3 days later, on May 1997, the two countries sign a treaty of friendship. On paper, it's a promise. Both nations vow to respect each other's borders and territorial integrity, refrain from threatening each other, and not to use force against the other. Basically, it's a commitment to peace between these two neighbors. Many at the time believe this treaty cements peace between neighbors. But beneath the surface, mistrust lingers. Meanwhile, further afield, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan begin forming a common economic space. It's an attempt to rebuild some of the trade and economic cooperation that existed within the Soviet Union before its collapse. The idea is to create a free trade zone and harmonize their economic regulations. On the surface, it looks like a good, neighborly partnership. But for Ukraine, it's also a balancing act between the economic interests of the East and the democratic aspirations of the West. Economically, Ukraine holds powerful cards. Its fertile soil produces vast harvest of corn, wheat, sunflower seeds, barley, and more, making it one of the world's breadbaskets. Its eastern territories still carry the heavy industries inherited from the Soviet era, rich in coal and minerals. Russia, meanwhile, has its own strengths, but they're elsewhere. By the turn of the century, Moscow controls nearly half of Europe's gas supply, and most of those pipelines run straight through Ukraine. This intertwining of energy, trade, and security ties the two nations together, but it also plants the seeds of future conflict because, for both sides, control of resources means control of power. For now, though, treaties are being signed and money is flowing. The stage is set for the next act in this Ukrainian saga. Will the shared prosperity bring Ukraine closer to Russia, or will it continue to push the country toward the West? And what happens in Crimea? We'll find out next time. How the end of the Cold War created the new Russian threat. And this is part 3 of our mini-series. Let's get straight to it. The year is 2004. It is one of the most important elections in the post-Soviet history of Ukraine. Two men symbolize two possible futures. On one side, Viktor Yushchenko, the pro-Western reformer who wants closer ties with Europe and eventual membership in NATO. On the other, Viktor Yanukovych, backed by Moscow, championing a pro-Russian course. When Yanukovych is declared the winner, alarm bells ring across the nation. There are reports of massive electoral fraud. especially in the east and the south of the country, where Yanukovych's supporters are concentrated. In the capital city of Kyiv, hundreds of thousands pour into the streets, their banners and orange flags filling Independence Square. It is the start of what will become known as the Orange Revolution, a non-violent uprising demanding democracy and fair elections. The protesters camped out in the square, determined to stay until the end. They sang songs, they prayed, they made love. Some of them, they were prepared to die. Under pressure from the people and the Ukrainian courts, the original results are a new vote is held. This time, Yushchenko wins, but his victory comes at a cost. During the campaign, he was mysteriously poisoned. His face was scarred by dioxin, a reminder of how high the stakes had become. As President, Yushchenko charts a new course for Ukraine, a course that brings the country closer to the European Union and keeps the prospect of NATO membership on the horizon. But Russia responds swiftly and strategically. Moscow plays its most powerful card, gas. In 2005, Gazprom, Russia's state energy giant, begins building a pipeline under the Baltic Sea that will allow it to send gas directly to Europe, bypassing Ukraine. This threatens billions of dollars in transit revenue for Kyiv. And when disputes arise over unpaid gas debts, Russia cuts supplies twice in the winter of 2005 and again in January 2009. The shockwaves are felt all across Eastern Europe. It is not only Ukraine that loses heat in the dead of winter. So do parts of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Austria. Then comes April 2008. At a NATO summit in Bucharest, the alliance declares that Ukraine and Georgia will one day become members, but fails to offer any timeline or guarantee. Many Western leaders, including Chancellor Angela Merkel, are hesitant and wary of angering Russia. For Vladimir Putin, the message is clear. NATO is inching closer to Russia's borders, and Ukraine is the prize. Meanwhile, Yushchenko's popularity plummets at home. Economic struggles and constant political infighting have eroded public trust. When he warns that he will cancel Russia's lease on Sevastopol, the naval base of the Black Sea Fleet on the Crimean Peninsula, if re-elected, he makes powerful enemies both in Moscow and in Ukraine. By the end of this chapter, Ukraine is more divided than ever. The country is torn between the dream of Europe and the shadow of Moscow. And the world is about to witness just how far Russia will go to keep Ukraine within its orbit. The year is 2010. Ukraine once again stands at a crossroads. The presidential election has come down to two figures. On one corner is Yulia Tymoshenko, the fiery former prime minister and the champion of the Orange Revolution. On the other is Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian leader who had been ousted during those very same protests in 2004. But this time, fortune smiles on him. He wins, and for Moscow, it is a welcome comeback. Almost immediately, he steers the country back toward Russia's orbit. One of his first major moves, extending the lease for the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol by 25 years, until 2042. In return, Ukraine secures cheaper gas. A few months later, he signs onto a new free trade bloc with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, cementing closer economic ties to the east. Meanwhile, domestically, Yanukovych introduces a language law, allowing regions where minorities make up more than 10% of the population to adopt their language officially. This mainly benefits Russian-speaking communities in the east and south of the country. But to many Ukrainians, it feels like a step toward Russification. Still, beneath the surface, a different path beckons. In 2013, an association agreement with the European Union is ready to be signed. It promises Ukraine access to European markets, investments, and closer ties with the West. For many, it represents a brighter, more democratic future. But in November 2013, everything changes. Viktor Yanukovych shocks the nation by announcing he will not sign the EU agreement. Instead, he pivots back to Moscow, securing a multi-billion-dollar bailout and energy deal from Russia. The die is cast. The next day, thousands of students and activists gather in Kyiv's Independence Square. They chant, they wave EU flags, they demand change. At first, it is a peaceful demonstration. But when riot police brutally disperse the crowds, the protests grow larger, stronger, and more determined. What began as a call for Europe quickly transforms into a demand for freedom, dignity, and an end to corruption. To make sense of these monumental events, let's take a step back and analyze the key factors at play. First, we must understand the enduring legacy of the Orange Revolution. This historic movement had not only brought down a corrupt regime, but had also set expectations for greater political participation, transparency, and democracy. When Yanukovych appeared to be steering Ukraine away from these ideals, it generated discontent and a yearning for change. Next, consider the profound impact of the economic crisis. As the global financial meltdown reverberated around the world, Ukraine felt the tremors deeply. Soaring unemployment, dwindling incomes, and a housing crisis became a breeding ground for discontent. People looked to the government for solutions, but instead saw unfulfilled promises and a widening gap between rich and poor. It was against this backdrop that the Euromaidan movement truly took off. And let's not forget the pivotal role of symbolism. The square itself, Maidan Nezalezhnosti, or Independence Square, holds immense historical significance. It was here in 2004 that the Orange Revolution had reached its crescendo. It was a place where Ukrainians had come together to demand democracy and freedom. And now, over a decade later, it was here that a new generation was gathering, demanding an end to corruption and a better future for Ukraine. But the true essence of the movement lay in its diversity. Euromaidan was not just a protest, it was a convergence of various strands of Ukrainian society. Students, intellectuals, politicians, and ordinary citizens from all walks of life came together under the banner of a shared desire for a better Ukraine. In the heart of the protest was the burning question of Europe or Russia. But it was much more than a simple binary. It was about charting an independent path, forging a unique Ukrainian identity that transcended the geopolitical chessboard. As we delve deeper into the story, keep these questions in mind. How did this protest evolve from a call for European integration to a full-blown revolution? And what were the forces that shaped this dramatic transformation? The coming episodes will take you to the very heart of Kyiv, where ordinary people dared to dream of a better Ukraine and in doing so, changed the course of history. It is February 2014. 4 months, the streets of Kyiv's Independence Square have been a battleground. The protesters who gathered here in November to demand closer ties with Europe have become an anathema to the government of Viktor Yanukovych. What began as a movement for European integration has transformed into a nationwide revolt against corruption and authoritarianism. The square Maidan Nezalezhnosti has become a sea of orange and blue, the colors of the Ukrainian flag. Here, protesters build barricades, set up medical stations, sing the national anthem, and face down riot police armed with batons, tear gas, and live ammunition. There are several attempts to clear the square. Each one is met with fierce resistance. On February 18th, as tensions escalate, dozens of demonstrators are killed when police open fire. Their sacrifice will forever be remembered as the Heavenly 100. With the body count rising and the situation spiraling out of control, Viktor Yanukovych flees Kyiv. On February 22nd, with protesters storming government buildings, Parliament declares him unfit to fulfill his duties, effectively removing him from power. But even as the people of Kyiv celebrate their victory over a corrupt and authoritarian leader, a new and far greater crisis begins to unfold. In Crimea, where the population is majority Russian-speaking, protests against the new government in Kyiv erupt almost immediately. Within days, armed men in unmarked uniforms seize the parliament building in Simferopol and take control of airports and other key infrastructure. The new government in Kyiv accuses Moscow of orchestrating the takeover. But, regardless of who is behind it, the speed with which Crimea has fallen into the hands of pro-Russian forces is alarming. Then, on March 16th, with Russian troops massing on the border, a rushed and internationally condemned referendum is held. The question before the voters: should Crimea become part of Russia? The official result: over 96% vote in favor of joining Russia. Within 2 days, Vladimir Putin signs the treaty annexing Crimea into the Russian Federation. The international reaction is swift and severe. The United States and the European Union impose economic sanctions on Moscow. Russia is expelled from the G8, returning the group to the G7. But if the rest of the world condemns the annexation within the borders of Ukraine, there is little that can be done. Crimea is gone. The last vestige of Soviet territorial control remains in the east. But it won't be for long. In the industrial heartland of Donbass, unrest spreads. Pro-Russian activists occupy government buildings in cities like Donetsk and Luhansk, declaring the creation of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. What begins as street protests soon transforms into armed conflict, as separatists backed by Moscow clash with Ukrainian forces. And so, a low-intensity war begins in the east, a frozen conflict that will persist to this very day. The annexation of Crimea is more than a land grab. It is a turning point because it signals that Russia is willing to use military force to reshape borders in Europe. For Ukraine, it marks the beginning of a war that will continue to this day. The post-Soviet balance has been shattered, and the world is watching a new Cold War take shape before its eyes. After the annexation of Crimea in March 2014, tensions in Ukraine did not end. They escalated. In the east, regions with large Russian-speaking populations became the center of unrest. On April 7th, pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk proclaimed the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, announcing that a referendum would soon follow. Just weeks later, in Luhansk, another separatist state was declared. Violence quickly followed. In cities across eastern Ukraine, clashes erupted between pro-Russian groups and Ukrainian loyalists. The most shocking occurred in Odessa on May 2, 2014, when violence spiraled out of control. Pro-Russian demonstrators took refuge in the trade union's house. A fire broke out inside, killing 48 people. To this day, responsibility remains contested, and no convictions have been made. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army moved to reassert control over the Donbass. But as Ukrainian forces advanced, they encountered something more organized than just local militias. Armed groups with advanced weaponry began to push back. Supported Ukraine claimed by covert Russian forces. Moscow denied direct involvement, insisting that any Russians fighting were merely volunteers on leave. As the summer of 2014 wore on, the conflict intensified. Ukraine launched offensives to retake separatist strongholds, and in some areas they made gains. But then came a turning point. large numbers of Russian soldiers crossed the border, reinforcing separatist defenses. A massive counteroffensive was launched, threatening to overwhelm Ukrainian forces near Mariupol, a crucial port on the Sea of Azov. The situation drew international concern. In September 2014, the Minsk Protocol, a ceasefire negotiated with the involvement of Russia, Ukraine, and the OSCE, was signed, but the truce quickly broke down. Fighting raged around key areas, especially the Donetsk International Airport, which became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. For months, heavily outnumbered Ukrainian soldiers, nicknamed the Cyborgs, defended the ruined terminal against waves of attacks. A second peace agreement, Minsk II, was signed in February 2015, this time with the mediation of France and Germany. It called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and decentralization of power in Ukraine. While the agreement reduced fighting, it did not end it. The front line stabilized, but sporadic clashes continued, locking Ukraine into a frozen conflict. By the end of 2015, the Donbas War had already claimed thousands of lives. More than 1 million people had fled their homes, and the region was scarred by destruction. For Ukraine, the conflict was both a territorial battle and a test of survival against its powerful neighbor. For Russia, it was a way to destabilize Ukraine and prevent its drift toward the West. The Donbas had become the new front line in the struggle between Moscow and Kyiv, conflict that, even after Minsk II, showed no sign of truly ending. Although the Minsk II agreements signed in February 2015 slowed the fighting in Donbas, it didn't solve the crisis. It merely put the war on pause while tension between Ukraine and Russia deepened. On one side, Ukraine moved closer to the West. In June 2014, it signed an association agreement with the European Union, which gradually came into effect, binding Ukraine's economy and politics more closely with Europe, a move that Moscow saw as a direct threat. At the same time, NATO's relationship with Ukraine intensified. While Ukraine was not admitted as a member, joint training programs increased and Kyiv reaffirmed its ambition to join the alliance. For Russia, NATO expansion remained a red line. Moscow insisted that Ukraine's path toward NATO membership was unacceptable and destabilizing. So Russia turned to energy, the cornerstone of its power. Nearly half of Europe's natural gas came from Russia, and most of it passed through Ukrainian pipelines. To bypass Kyiv, Moscow began investing heavily in alternative routes. The Nord Stream pipeline under the Baltic Sea, linking Russia directly to Germany, was expanded with Nord Stream 2. At the same time, construction of the Turk Stream pipeline across the Black Sea ensured that Russia could supply Europe via Turkey. These projects were not just economic, they were strategic tools designed to reduce Ukraine's leverage. By 2018, the rivalry shifted to the seas. Russia completed the Crimean Bridge, a massive structure linking mainland Russia to the annexed Crimean Peninsula. Spanning the Kerch Strait, the bridge was both an engineering triumph and a political message. Crimea was now firmly Russian, but it also gave Moscow control over a vital choke point. Ukraine's eastern exports, especially from the port of Mariupol, depended on access through the Kerch Strait and the Sea of Azov. On November 25, 2018, confrontation erupted. 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels attempted to pass through the strait toward Mariupol. Russian forces blocked their passage with a cargo ship, then opened fire, injuring 6 Ukrainians and capturing all 3 vessels and their crews. Moscow accused Kyiv of violating its territorial waters. Ukraine called it an act of aggression. The Kerch Strait incident marked a new phase of escalation. Ukraine imposed martial law in several regions, while Western powers condemned Russia's actions and tightened sanctions. For Kyiv, the event confirmed that Moscow was willing to squeeze Ukraine not only on land but also at sea. Meanwhile, Ukrainian politics saw a dramatic shift. In 2019, comedian and political outsider Volodymyr Zelenskyy won the presidential election in a landslide. Campaigning on promises to end the war in the east and fight corruption, his victory reflected widespread frustration with years of conflict, economic hardship, and distrust of the political elite. But Zelenskyy inherited a deeply divided country, a frozen war in Donbass, and a hostile neighbor determined to keep Ukraine under pressure. As he prepared to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, the world wondered, could he deliver peace, or was Ukraine destined for an even larger conflict? Okay, now it's time for some rapid-fire questions. First question: what happened in Minsk II? Well, Minsk II was a set of peace agreements intended to end the fighting in eastern Ukraine. It was signed in 2014 and it included a ceasefire, prisoner exchanges, and the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line. But it wasn't really a comprehensive peace deal. Fighting continued, and the underlying political issues were never really resolved. Next question: what is the significance of the Kerch Strait? The Kerch Strait is a narrow body of water that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov. It's significant because it is a key shipping route for oil and gas from Russia to the Mediterranean. Control over the strait gives Russia the ability to restrict Ukrainian access to the sea, and vice versa. And finally, what was the significance of the 2019 election? The 2019 election was significant because it showed that despite the ongoing conflict and foreign pressure, Ukrainians still had faith in their democracy. The election was seen as a rebuke to both Russia and the West, and it paved the way for a new leader who promised to end the war. So, it's February 2022, and tensions between Ukraine and Russia couldn't be higher. By early 2022, tension between Ukraine and Russia had reached its peak. Nearly 190,000 Russian troops were massed along Ukraine's borders, not only in the east but also in Belarus and Crimea. The world watched anxiously, unsure whether this was a bluff or the prelude to a full-scale war. On February 21, 2022, Vladimir Putin addressed the Russian nation in a long and striking speech. He framed Ukraine not as an independent country, but as a historical mistake. He blamed Vladimir Lenin for creating the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1922 and accused past Soviet leaders of handing over Russian lands, including Crimea, to Kyiv. He claimed that Ukrainians and Russians were one people, separated artificially by a border. And he portrayed the Ukrainian government as a gang of neo-Nazis who oppressed Russian speakers and perpetrated genocide against them. More than history was at stake. Putin painted modern Ukraine as a failed state, corrupt, unstable, and dangerous because of its growing ties to NATO. He accused Kyiv of oppressing Russian-speaking populations and even used the word genocide to describe Ukraine's policies in the Donbass. But he saved his most incendiary comments for Ukraine's desire to join NATO. If Ukraine became a NATO member, he warned Russia would be threatened by foreign bases and missiles on its northern borders. Then, in a shocking conclusion, Putin announced that Russia would officially recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. He justified this move as undoing a historical wrong committed by Lenin in 1922. Putin summoned the separatist leaders to the Kremlin, where he signed treaties of friendship and mutual assistance, which included a security pact that opened the door for Russian troops to enter these territories legally, at least in Moscow's eyes. But this was only the beginning. 2 days later, on the morning of February 24, 2022, Putin delivered another speech, one that would change the world. At dawn, he announced the start of a special military operation. His stated objectives were to disarm and denazify Ukraine and to protect Russian-speaking citizens. He warned the Ukrainian military not to resist and threatened any foreign power that dared to intervene. Within minutes, explosions thundered across Ukraine. Russian missiles and airstrikes targeted air bases, radar stations, and command centers. From 4 directions, Russian forces advanced. From Crimea in the south, from Donbas in the east, from Belgorod toward Kharkov, and from Belarus directly toward Kyiv. The plan was ambitious and swift. Russian forces aimed to seize Hostomel Airport just outside Kyiv, establish an air bridge for reinforcements, surround the capital, and topple the Ukrainian government within days. The Kremlin believed President Zelenskyy would flee. A puppet regime would be installed, and Ukraine would be neutralized as a Western ally. But Ukraine resisted. Zelenskyy refused to leave Kyiv, famously declaring, "I need ammunition, not a ride." Across the country, civilians joined defense units, while the Ukrainian military, hardened by years of conflict in Donbas, stood firm. What Russia expected to be a lightning strike would instead ignite the largest war in Europe since World War II, a war that would last far longer, cost far more, and reshape the world in ways no one fully anticipated. On the morning of February 24, 2022, as Russian missiles struck across Ukraine, one of the Kremlin's most daring operations began. The assault on Hostomel Airport, just outside Kyiv. Dozens of Russian helicopters flew low over the Dnipro River, carrying elite paratroopers. Their mission was critical: seize the airport, secure the runway, and create a bridgehead for transport planes loaded with troops and heavy equipment. With Hostomel under control, Russian forces could rapidly encircle Kyiv and install a new pro-Russian government within days. But Ukraine was prepared. Soldiers had parked trucks and buses along the runway to block landings. As the helicopters approached, Ukrainian defenses opened fire, shooting down several aircraft. One crashed spectacularly on the tarmac, creating more wreckage and further blocking the airstrip. For 2 hours, fierce fighting raged. Eventually, Russian troops captured the airport, but their victory was hollow. During their retreat, Ukrainian forces destroyed the runway with artillery fire. The planned arrival of Russian transport planes, carrying between 1,000 and 2,000 reinforcements, had to be cancelled. The failure at Hostomel was catastrophic for Moscow's strategy. Without an air bridge, Russian troops advancing from Belarus were forced to rely on a long, narrow supply route through Chernobyl and Ivankiv, slowed by destroyed bridges and ambushes. What was supposed to be a rapid march on Kyiv turned into a grinding advance. Meanwhile, across the country, Ukrainian resistance stiffened. In Kharkov, Ukraine's second-largest city, locals armed with Molotov cocktails and rifles repelled assaults. In the south, Russian troops captured Kherson but met unexpected resistance in Mykolaiv, halting their drive toward Odessa. Perhaps the most shocking symbol of Russian miscalculation was the infamous 40-mile-long convoy north of Kyiv. Satellite images showed hundreds of tanks, trucks, and artillery vehicles stalled for days, stuck by fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and Ukrainian ambushes. The world watched as one of the most powerful armies in the world appeared paralyzed. In the face of this unexpectedly stiff resistance, the Kremlin's grand plan began to unravel. Russia had hoped to achieve its goals in a matter of days. But by mid-March, it was clear. The special military operation had not gone to plan. Zelenskyy was still in Kyiv. Ukraine's government remained intact, and international support was surging. Far from collapsing, Ukraine had become a symbol of defiance. For Russia, what was intended to be a lightning war was turning into a drawn-out conflict. And with every passing day, the costs in soldiers, equipment, and reputation grew higher. It's hard to overstate the debacle at Hostomel. It perfectly captures the hubris and incompetence of Russia's military leadership. Seizing an airport 8 kilometers from the capital seemed like a sure bet. But in the lead-up to the invasion, the Kremlin had wildly overestimated its capabilities and drastically underestimated Ukraine's will to fight. Russian commanders expected little resistance from Ukraine's army. They believed Kyiv would fall in 2 days, maybe less, and so they brought only a fraction of their air assets into the war, just 30 to 50 combat aircraft and 60 helicopters. That left them with barely enough firepower to conduct the initial barrage of missile strikes, let alone provide close air support or conduct airstrikes against Ukrainian positions. What's more, the Russians failed to appreciate the importance of securing the skies over Ukraine. This failure allowed the US and its allies to deploy sophisticated air defense systems like the Nassos, which shot down dozens of Russian planes and helicopters. And it also gave Ukrainian fighters a chance to inflict serious damage on Russian air power. When the fighting began, Ukrainian forces shot down an incredible 15 planes and 8 helicopters in the first 2 days. That included for Su-35s, the best fighter jets in the Russian arsenal. Such losses are nearly impossible to make up. There simply aren't enough trained pilots and air crews in reserve to replace them. As for the debacle at Hostomel, it wasn't just a failure of planning. It was also a failure of execution. The Russian assault force was too small to seize and secure the airport. Once they gained control of the tarmac, they were unable to stop Ukrainian artillery from destroying the runway. To make matters worse, the Ukrainians destroyed another Russian helicopter with a shoulder-fired missile. Then, when the Russians finally managed to land some aircraft, they were forced to abandon them because of fuel shortages caused by Ukraine's targeting of Russian supply trucks. And that is how one of the most audacious plans in modern warfare turned into one of the greatest disasters. As Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the world reacted with a speed and unity it hadn't shown in a long time. Within days, sweeping economic sanctions were imposed, all of them aimed at one thing: to make Russia pay. The assets of major Russian banks were frozen. Oligarchs saw their yachts, mansions, and overseas accounts seized. Europe, the United States, and Canada closed their airspace to Russian airlines. And then came the economic sanctions, trade embargoes, and technology export bans that will cripple Russia's ability to produce anything from cars to fighter jets. Even China and India, who refrained from condemning the invasion, announced they would align with the sanctions. For Russia, the blow was immense. The ruble collapsed. Interest rates skyrocketed, and ordinary citizens rushed to a Temiz as the economy braced for a freefall. Yet Moscow boasted of its resilience, leaning on energy exports to China and India, brushing off the sanctions as the West's futile attempts to contain it. Meanwhile, Ukraine's plight stirred solidarity around the world. Leaders across Europe condemned the invasion. Ordinary citizens took to the streets, waving blue and yellow flags. Countries that had long hesitated, like Germany, which had been neutral for decades, announced historic shifts. Germany pledged to send weapons to Ukraine and agreed to spend billions diversifying its energy supplies away from Russia. On the battlefield, information was becoming as important as tanks and missiles. Russia launched massive cyber attacks and bombed Ukraine's communication infrastructure, hoping to silence the country. But an unexpected ally emerged. Elon Musk's Starlink satellites. Within days, terminals arrived in Ukraine, restoring internet connectivity that had been knocked offline by the Russian cyber attacks. It was a lifeline for the country. It allowed government officials, soldiers, and civilians to stay connected, broadcasting updates, coordinating defenses, and ensuring the world saw events unfold in real time. This was not just about military hardware anymore. This was a war being fought on a new front, the informational front. In this war, every image, every video, every post and tweet could sway world opinion and bring in more support. And the world was watching. Videos of Ukrainian farmers towing away abandoned Russian tanks or President Zelenskyy walking through Kyiv in defiance went viral. These clips galvanized international support and undermined Russian propaganda that claimed the invasion was a limited special operation. Yet inside Russia, the Kremlin cracked down hard. Independent media outlets were shut down. Social networks were restricted, and a new law imposed up to 15 years in prison for spreading so-called fake news, which now included calling the war a war. Thousands of anti-war protesters were arrested in Moscow and other cities. The Kremlin was determined to control the narrative both at home and abroad. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the war had become something Russia hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just a battle of tanks and troops. It was a clash of narratives, symbols, and the fight for truth. The Ukrainian resistance was fierce, and the West's response was united. Russia hoped to outlast the sanctions and grind Ukraine into submission. But with Western arms flowing in, Ukrainian morale high, and with the world watching, it was clear this war would not end quickly. The special military operation had become a global confrontation. With Ukraine at its center, a front line not only of tanks and artillery, but also of narratives, symbols, and the fight for truth itself. It was spring 2022, and this was the world. What will 2022 be remembered for? The pandemic, climate change, inflation, wars. Will there be peace in our lifetime? Will we ever learn from history? By April 2022, Russia's plan for a lightning victory had collapsed. The armored columns meant to encircle Kyiv were stalled and vulnerable. After weeks of fighting and supply failures, Moscow ordered a withdrawal from northern Ukraine. The world braced to see what had been left behind. In the Kyiv suburb of Bucha, Ukrainian forces discovered a scene that shocked the globe. Bodies of civilians lay scattered in the streets, some bound, some shot at close range. Mass graves were uncovered. Survivors spoke of torture, executions, and months of terror under occupation. The Kremlin dismissed the evidence as staged. But satellite imagery, eyewitness accounts, and journalists on the ground confirmed the atrocities. Bucha became a symbol, not just of Russia's brutality, but of why Ukraine's resistance was so determined. With the northern front abandoned, Russia regrouped. It announced a new second phase of the war. The complete capture of the Donbas region. Towns like Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Bakhmut became household names as artillery duels and trench warfare echoed the darkest chapters of 20th century conflict. To support its push, Russia relied heavily on mercenaries from the Wagner Group commanded by Yevgeny. Recruits came from prisons, lured by promises of freedom after 6 months of service. Their losses were staggering, but Moscow pressed on. Ukraine, for its part, received the first shipments of Western heavy weapons. American HIMARS rocket systems, British anti-tank missiles, and European artillery. These deliveries gave Kyiv the means to strike Russian logistics far behind the front, changing the dynamics of the battlefield. Yet the fighting in Donbass remained grinding and costly. Ukrainian soldiers held their ground, but villages and towns were reduced to rubble. By summer, Russia claimed control of all of Luhansk Oblast, while Ukraine braced its defenses further west. The war had entered a new phase. Not a quick invasion, but a slow, attritional struggle. Every kilometer was paid for in blood, and, as both sides dug in, it became clear. The conflict was far from over, and the Donbass would become its crucible. By 2023, the war in Ukraine had settled into a grinding stalemate. Clashes continued, but without either side gaining any significant ground. Meanwhile, something else was happening. A different kind of battle was raging inside Russia itself. And this one threatened Vladimir Putin's grip on power. At the heart of it was Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, once a loyal ally and caterer to the Kremlin, providing food for the president and intelligence officials. Prigozhin had turned into one of Putin's most vocal critics. His fighters had borne the brunt of the battles for Soledar and Bakhmut, suffering tens of thousands of casualties. And he blamed Russia's military leaders for their incompetence. According to Prigozhin, they were starving his men of ammunition, while sending them into what he called a meat grinder in a futile attempt to capture Bakhmut. But now, in May, after months of bloody combat, Wagner forces finally captured the city. But instead of victory bringing unity, the rift between Wagner and Russia's Ministry of Defense grew wider. Russia's defense minister Shoigu announced that all Wagner units would be incorporated into the regular army. Privately, Prigozhin vowed revenge. And then came June 2023. In a stunning move, Prigozhin ordered his fighters to march north. Without firing a shot, his troops seized the city of Rostov-on-Don, a key military hub. From there, columns of Wagner troops advanced toward Moscow. Overnight, Russia, a nuclear superpower, faced what looked like the beginnings of a civil war. Putin denounced the rebellion as treason, vowing severe punishment. But in less than 24 hours, the crisis ended. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko brokered a deal. Prigozhin would halt his advance in exchange for safe passage to Belarus, while Wagner fighters were given the choice to disband, join the regular army, or follow him into exile. It was a humiliating climb down for both sides. But make no mistake, the mutiny revealed deep cracks in Russia's war machine, not just on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. For the first time, Putin's aura of control was shaken. But Prigozhin was as good as gone. And as far as rebellions go, this one fizzled out pretty quickly. But what does it say about where the country is headed? Like, what does this all mean for the war in Ukraine? Well, probably not much. Yes, Russia's internal problems are growing. But none of this changes the fact that Ukraine is still locked in a war with the second largest nuclear power in the world. And while morale might suffer, Ukraine's international allies remain committed to supplying arms and ammunition. NATO's support has only grown since the invasion. And with each passing month, Ukraine becomes more capable of striking Russian targets. That could mean that despite Russia's domestic issues, this war will continue to drag on. What about the future of the Wagner Group? Well, after June, it effectively ceased to exist as an independent force. Some of its fighters were absorbed into the Russian army, while others fled to Belarus or went into exile. As for Prigozhin himself, he apparently had plans to re-establish Wagner in Africa and continue his mercenary operations there. But those plans were cut short. On August 23rd, just 2 months after the mutiny, Prigozhin boarded a private jet bound for St. Petersburg. As it flew over the Tver region, north of Moscow, explosives planted in the aircraft detonated, killing all 10 people on board. Few doubted it was revenge, a warning to anyone who might defy the Kremlin again. So, did Prigozhin have a point? Was the way he acted in June justified? After all, he wasn't the only one complaining about shortages of supplies and ammunition. But ultimately, he paid the price for taking his complaints too far. Remember, it's one thing to complain about incompetence, or even plot to remove someone from power. It's quite another to launch an open and direct challenge to the leader of the state itself. Putin survived the mutiny and wasted no time crushing the threat once and for all. What does this all say about the state of Russia today? Well, the mutiny showed that Putin's grip on power isn't absolute. There are limits to his authority. You can push those limits, as Prigozhin proved, but you do so at your own peril. At the same time, the mutiny revealed cracks in the system. Never before had someone dared to challenge Putin so directly, to seize a key military headquarters and march on the capital. Perhaps the war in Ukraine has taken such a heavy toll on the Russian state that such acts are now possible.